All right, welcome to our first lesson for chapter 3. This is lesson 3.1. We're going to talk about decisions and risk. This was our first lesson in a really quick chapter just talking about environmental economics. So if you've taken economics before, some of this will sound familiar. If you have not, we're going to do a really brief intro into economics. So lesson objective here is that you will be able to describe the power in making decisions and the risks associated with them. So for making decisions, whether we recognize it or not, most life decisions involve a consideration of two factors, risk and cost. Typically, the two factors of risk and cost are interrelated and must be considered at the same time. Most decisions related to environmental issues involve characterizing the risks incurred by people and other living things and evaluating the cost of taking the action to eliminating the risk as well as the cost of doing nothing. So we want to look at, okay, what is this actually going to cost to do, both money-wise, and then what's the risk to people and to the environment? And then if we don't do those things, what's the risk or cost there as well? And we're going to talk about all of those pieces a little bit more specifically. So when we're talking about risk is the probability that a condition or action will lead to an injury, damage, or loss. And again, when we're looking at this from an environmental science standpoint, we are concerned about both humans and nature, the environment, all of those things. And then probability is a mathematical statement about how likely it is that something will happen. We don't just guess on this. Data is used to put this together. And it's really important to make a distinction between probability and possibility. When we say that something is possible, we're just saying it could maybe happen. It's very inexact. It's a guess. Probability is specific and it defines it in mathematical terms how likely it is to occur. So probability and possibility, not the same thing. So probability is often stated in terms of the probability of developing a particular disease or illness is 1 in 10,000, or the likelihood of winning the lottery is 1 in 5 million. That is probability. It's stated in math terms. The consequences of a bad outcome resulting from accepting a risk may be minor or catastrophic. So that would be big risk versus smaller risk, or smaller risk versus big risk. The economic cost of dealing with bad outcomes is one of the consequences of accepting a risk. Most of the consequences we would deal with, we would have to deal with using some amount of money. So that's also going to be an economic cost. Environmental risk assessment uses facts and assumptions to estimate probability of harm to people or the environment from particular environmental factors and conditions. Again, we are focusing on people and the environment. That is environmental science. Assessing the risk of a particular activity, chemical, technology, or policy to humans is difficult. Several sources of information and tools are used to help clarify the risk. And sometimes we have one source that says this is the risk, one source that says this, and so it takes a lot to put all the information together and figure out what that risk actually is. Then we get into risk management. So we know the risk is there. How do we deal with it? So risk management is a decision-making process that involves using the results of risk assessment and selecting actions to minimize or eliminate the risk. It is included as a part of all good environmental management systems within business and industry. So a risk management plan should include evaluating the scientific information regarding various kinds of risks, not just whatever information you find. It should be scientific information. Deciding how much risk is acceptable, and this isn't going to be the same for every place, every company, every whatever. That's going to change. And then deciding which risks should be given the highest priority. Deciding where the greatest benefit would be realized by spending limited funds, because usually it's economics, we want to be able to save some of that money. Deciding how the plan will be enforced and monitored. And then when we do have that risk management plan and we have that perception of risk and all of that, when we look at perception of risk versus actual risk, they don't always agree. So there's often discrepancies between scientific and public perception of environmental risks. So what is the proper role of government and other organizations in the management of risk? Should the government focus on available resources and technology where they can have the greatest tangible impact on human and ecological well-being? Or should the government focus resources on problems about which the public is most upset? And remember, when we're asking these questions, because I'm asking you on your notes right now, which you think is the answer. The scientific perception of risk and the public perception of risk don't always agree. And I'm going to show you that on the next slide. So hopefully the government's using scientific data. Public may not be using that scientific data. So which should they be doing? So this is perception of risk for common things. So hazardous waste sites. The blue is what the public thinks, and the yellow gold color is more like the real measured risk. So hazardous waste sites, people think they are very, very dangerous, and they really aren't that bad. Persistent organic, so like fertilizers, public thinks they're a little bit worse than they are. Sewage, public thinks they're much worse. Radiation, heavy metals. And then over here we get into where we're not agreeing and the risk is higher than what public thinks. So population growth is a huge risk to our future. Loss of wildlife habitat, huge risk to us having clean, accessible resources. Global warming, pesticides, we're pretty agreed. Wetlands loss, invasive species, all of those are things that are much higher risk to us than most people in the public believe. All right, if you have any questions on that, please let me know, and I will see you in the next one.